Hey guys! Tonight we drift into one of the more peculiar corners of European justice, where the clang of a gavel might be followed, improbably, by the flap of wings and the squawk of a feathered witness. You are there, in the dim courtroom of the 18th century, benches filled with yawning clerks and townsfolk, and on a polished perch near the magistrate's bench, a parrot that doesn't know it's about to be the star of the show. You might think your own traffic tickets are dull, but here you are about to learn how a talking bird once made a trial as memorable as a circus act. And yes, you probably wouldn't survive this if it were your reputation on the line. Try explaining yourself while a parrot blurts out your secrets. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And I'd love it if you'd leave a comment telling me your location and local time. Who knows, maybe someone across the world is drifting off to the same parroty courtroom right now. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You shuffle across creaking wooden floorboards, the air thick with candle wax and the faint mildew of old ledgers. The judge peers down, wig tilted slightly askew, while clerks dip quills into inky pots, trying not to blot the parchment. Then, in the silence, a parrot screeches something halfway between guilty and a cough. The room titters nervously, because of course the bird was never sworn in, and no one knows whether its phrase is rehearsed, random, or the echo of some tavern brawl heard the night before. This might sound like folklore, but 18th century Europe did in fact harbor instances where animals and even inanimate objects played roles in court. The parrot stands as a particularly delightful emblem of the absurdities of the time, a reminder that human beings were eager to search for truth even in the unlikeliest of sources. Historians still argue whether parrots were genuinely consulted as evidence, or whether these were courtroom entertainments exaggerated in pamphlets. Either way, the squawking presence symbolized the blurred line between justice and theater. You sit in the gallery, trying not to chuckle, as the defendant, a weary merchant accused of fraud, glares at the bird as though it were a malicious gossip. The judge clears his throat, but the parrot interrupts again, mimicking the sound of coins clinking. One juror raises an eyebrow. Could this feathered witness be hinting at the stolen silver? Or is it simply mocking the rustle of coins the bailiff carries at his belt? You realize the absurdity. Truth here feels almost secondary to the spectacle. Mainstream fact time. Courts in early modern Europe, stretching into the 18th century, were often public affairs, attended as much for entertainment as for justice. People came to gawk, gossip, and sometimes doze through proceedings, much like attending a long sermon. That means the parrot, whether literally present or just rumored, fits the atmosphere perfectly, half solemnity, half comedy. And here's your quirky tidbit. One French satirical pamphlet describes a parrot shouting profanities during a bishop's trial, leading the judge to request the bird's removal lest its testimony sway the jury with undue mirth. Whether this ever truly happened or not, the fact it was printed and circulated shows how believable such a scene seemed to readers. The parrot continues to squawk while you lean against the polished rail, eyelids heavy. The judge bangs his gavel, ironically drowned out by the parrot imitating the very same bang, a perfect echo. You imagine how unsettling it must have been to have your life debated alongside a mimic bird who couldn't tell solemnity from satire. And you wonder, how different is this from the media circus of modern trials? Perhaps less neon, but equally dramatic. As you slip deeper into the narrative, you notice the townsfolk are not shocked. They treat the interruption as part of the entertainment value. For them, truth is a slippery thing, and justice has always included a touch of theatre. You recall that in some Swiss cantons, animals were put on trial well into the 18th century. A pig that trampled crops, a goat accused of witchcraft. If an animal could stand as a defendant, why not a parrot as a witness? You catch the smell of ink, the shuffle of feet, and the slow exhale of bored jurors. The parrot mutters a phrase that suspiciously sounds like the merchant's nickname, and the courtroom murmurs again. Historians still argue whether these moments influenced outcomes, or whether judges wisely ignored them. But you sense that reputations lived or died on whispers, and sometimes those whispers had feathers. Your thoughts drift. Perhaps the parrot was more honest than the humans. After all, gossip was the bloodstream of small towns, and parrots only repeat what they hear. Couldn't this bird be offering the most truthful testimony available? Or maybe it was just imitating a drunken tavern song, stripped of all meaning. Either way, the room treats it as though it were significant. You, too, feel lulled into the rhythm of squawks and quill scratches, the cadence of nonsense cloaked in formality. And somewhere in this dim wooden chamber, between the solemn wig of the judge and the flutter of feathers, you feel the softness of absurd history brushing against your mind. It's not frightening, not shocking, just oddly calming, like drifting down a slow stream with occasional splashes from a playful bird. The merchant sighs, the clerk yawns, and you, leaning forward, almost doze as the parrot whispers its last word of the day, coin. You trudge out of the musty courtroom, the parrot squawk still ringing faintly in your ears, and wander into the cool, cobbled square. The night is closing in, lanterns flickering in their iron cages, and in front of you looms another form of punishment you cannot ignore, the stocks and pillories, waiting patiently for tomorrow's unlucky occupants. You've probably seen drawings of these contraptions, wooden frames with holes for heads and hands, but standing before them now, you realize just how awkward and humiliating they must have been. You imagine slipping your own neck through the rough hole, arms locked forward, body stiff, unable to scratch an itch on your nose. You wouldn't last an hour, let alone the days some endured. The crowd tomorrow will come slowly, baskets of vegetables swinging, not for feeding, but for throwing. The stocks are a reminder that punishment here was not just about pain, but about spectacle, forcing you to hold still while everyone else moved about freely. In a strange way, it was theatre again, but this time you are the stage. Children laugh, housewives tisk, men toss comments as casually as they toss turnips. You can almost hear the murmur of disapproval blending with the squelch of rotting fruit. A mainstream fact, pillories were used throughout Europe well into the 18th century, not just for thieves, but for those guilty of fraud, perjury, or even publishing seditious pamphlets. Daniel Defoe, the author of Robinson Crusoe, once found himself in a pillory for criticizing the government. Ironically, sympathetic crowds cheered him instead of pelting him
turning his punishment into a sort of victory parade. So the pillory could humiliate or elevate, depending on the mood of the crowd. And here's your quirky tidbit. In some towns, local bakers were pilloried, not for fraud, but for selling underweight bread. Imagine being locked up because your loaf didn't quite measure up. To make things even stranger, the bakers were sometimes forced to wear their defective loaves strung around their necks like a bizarre necklace. Fashion forward? Probably not. Memorable? Absolutely. You lean on the wooden frame, feeling the splinters against your fingertips. You picture the condemned trying to shift their weight, feet cramping, the slow ache creeping into their shoulders. It's not the kind of suffering that shocks the senses, but the drawn-out discomfort that gnaws at the mind. You'd have plenty of time to think about your mistakes, about the jeers around you, and maybe about whether your parrot friend from the courtroom might be more merciful than these villagers. Historians still argue whether the pillory's effectiveness came from physical pain or social shame. After all, what lingers longer, the bruise from a thrown cabbage or the memory of neighbors laughing at you, whispering for years afterwards about that time you got locked up for shortchanging a customer? Perhaps the real sting was reputational, a punishment that kept echoing long after the wood was removed. You picture one unfortunate fellow, perhaps a tailor caught cheating with cloth measurements, his head poking through the wooden board. Around his neck dangles a strip of fabric cut suspiciously short. The symbolism is as heavy as the wood itself. Justice made literal and visible, a walking billboard of guilt. It is almost comical if you weren't the one trapped there. You remind yourself you wouldn't survive this either, not with your patience level. The air in the square is cool, and the lantern light drapes across the cobbles like a soft blanket. You hear the echo of boots clacking, a stray dog sniffing at the base of the pillory, uninterested in justice, only in crumbs. Tomorrow the dog will have better luck. Half-eaten vegetables and maybe a chunk of bread will fall to the ground, rewards for his silent attendance at the theatre of shame. And yet some convicts treated their time in the stocks with surprising resilience. A London anecdote tells of a man who sang songs while locked in, entertaining the crowd so much that people tipped him with coins instead of insults. You can almost hum along to his tune, his voice bouncing off the stone walls, turning punishment into performance art. It makes you wonder whether the line between punishment and entertainment was deliberately blurred, as if society wanted both lessons and laughs. Your eyes wander upward, tracing the outline of the old town hall against the night sky. Inside, clerks and judges shuffled papers, but outside here, justice is visible, tactile, even ridiculous. You feel the weight of that wooden beam across your shoulders in your imagination, the crowd pressing in with murmurs and chuckles. The pillory stands empty tonight, but its silence is almost louder than the jeers you know will fill it tomorrow. And as you stand there, arms folded, you feel sleep tugging at the edges of your awareness, as though the steady rhythm of humiliation repeated across centuries could be a lullaby in itself. Stocks creak, ropes sway gently in the breeze, and you lean back, glad it isn't your name carved in the court records. For now, you're only a witness to this slow, strange theatre of justice, drifting along as the lantern light flickers softer and softer.
You shuffle a little further down the cobblestones, away from the empty pillory and into the heart of the marketplace. Here, justice isn't tucked inside a courtroom or restrained to a wooden frame. It's right out in the open, where people buy apples, gossip about neighbors, and haggle over cheese. At the very center stands a tall post, its iron rings gleaming faintly in the lantern glow. This is the whipping post, its presence as familiar to locals as the baker's stall or the fishmonger's cart. You lean against the edge of a fountain and try to imagine being tied there, the crowd pressing in, while punishment played out in rhythm like some grim percussion. You probably wouldn't last long here either. Your patience would fray at the first crack of leather. The whipping post was meant to be public, and it worked almost like free street theatre. Shoppers would pause mid-haggling to watch a few lashes being dealt. The sound was not hidden. It echoed off the stone buildings, mingling with the calls of vendors. The idea wasn't only to hurt the body, but to carve fear into the minds of anyone tempted to commit the same crime. You shift your weight uneasily, sensing that the post was as much about deterrence as it was about punishment. A mainstream fact, flogging was still widely used across Europe in the 18th century, particularly for theft, vagrancy, and desertion. In England, some offenders were whipped along a set route, tied to the back of a cart, with a constable guiding the grim parade through town. Each crack of the whip carried the lesson further, like an announcement shouted to every bystander. But here's your quirky tidbit. In certain German towns, the whip was replaced by bundles of birch twigs soaked in brine because the salt stung more and supposedly purified the offense. Some local records even mention citizens being invited to donate their own bundles of twigs for the punishment, as though lending a hand in housekeeping. You can picture the scene, someone proudly handing over a neatly tied bundle of salty branches, then hurrying back to finish their shopping, punishment and errands done in one trip. You glance at the post again, the iron ring catching faint moonlight. You imagine a poor fellow tied there, shivering in the breeze, not knowing whether the whip would sting worse than the laughter of onlookers. Some merchants might cheer, others might secretly pity. Historians still argue whether these punishments truly reduced crime, or whether they simply satisfied a community's desire to watch someone else suffer. Maybe crime dipped, maybe it didn't, but the whipping post remained, a permanent reminder that order was fragile, held together by spectacle and fear. Your eyes wander across the square, baskets of onions stacked neatly, a dog nosing through straw, a fiddler playing softly near a tavern door, and then, above it all, the sharp crack of rope or leather. It cuts through the noise like a drumbeat in an otherwise sleepy song. You feel the rhythm more than the pain, a steady reminder that law was never subtle here. It had to be seen, heard, and remembered. There's something strangely sleepy about the predictability of it all. The crowd always gathers. The constable always shouts. The whip always cracks. And then, eventually, the offender slumps forward, punishment done, the market resuming its normal flow as though nothing happened. A moment of drama swallowed by daily routine. You close your eyes and hear the marketplace slowly swallowing the sound, the thump of boots, the rustle of skirts, the muttered complaints about prices. Another curious detail drifts through your mind. In some towns,
The punished were allowed to shout out their innocence, their voices mingling with the rhythm of the lash. Occasionally, a crowd believed them, jeering not at the tied figure, but at the authorities. That unpredictability gave the whipping post a strange dual nature, sometimes reinforcing authority, sometimes undermining it completely. It makes you wonder whether the real fear wasn't the pain of the lash, but the possibility of the crowd's mood turning against you. The night air feels heavy with wax and smoke, and you pull your cloak tighter. You picture yourself as one of the onlookers, holding a pear in one hand, watching with half interest while thinking mostly about dinner. For most, these punishments were background noise, woven into daily routine. Only for the punished did time crawl slowly, each second stretched like a bowstring before it snaps. You lean back against the fountain, the water trickling gently, a counterpoint to the imagined crack of whips. The parrot from earlier echoes faintly in your mind, squawking, "Coin!" as though mocking how justice seems to balance between punishment and performance. And here in the marketplace, the performance is unavoidable, stitched into the very rhythm of civic life. Gradually, the scene softens in your mind. The whip cracks fade into the background, blending with the sleepy hum of a night market winding down. Lanterns flicker, shadows stretch across the cobbles, and your own heartbeat slows with the rhythm. You realize you are less frightened now, more lulled, as though the steady, predictable repetition of punishment has turned into something strangely hypnotic.
You drift from the marketplace's echoing whip cracks toward a quieter corner, where the night air smells of coal, leather, and something sharper, like a candle guttering on burnt sugar. A brazier glows in a narrow alley by the jail, and beside it rests a tidy rack of iron letters. They are simple capitals, practical as broom handles, and you realize with a small shiver that this alphabet writes on skin instead of paper. You crouch near the warmth, hearing the soft puff of a bellows and the faint clink of tongs, and you picture the routine. Heat the iron to a steady cherry red, steady the hand, press for just a breath, then pull away. It is not the shriek and spectacle of the marketplace. Branding, at least in this corner, feels like office hours, administrative, efficient, and soulless, the sort of procedure that makes you wish for a very different kind of paperwork. You stand at the threshold as the turnkey shuffles by, keys chiming like dull bells, and you think about the odd logic of letters. A T for theft, a V for vagrancy, or simply a mark that says, "You have already been shown mercy once." That last one makes you swallow. The mark can be a receipt for leniency, a visible benefit of clergy burned onto the thumb to stop you from collecting the same discount twice. Mainstream fact, in parts of 18th century England, offenders who escaped the harshest penalties by claiming benefit of clergy could be branded on the thumb to signify the privilege had been used, a bureaucratic scar that clerks would check in future hearings. You flex your own thumb instinctively. If clerks are checking hands like shopkeepers check coins, you will keep your fingers in your pockets. Thanks. You watch the brazier flare gently, orange peeling into red, and you imagine the little ceremony. No drum roll, no cabbage throwing, just a brief pressure and a hiss like rain on hot stone. The hush of it makes you drowsy. You could almost doze off in the heat, were it not for the prickly awareness that letters might be arranged again for someone else before dawn.
You try to find comfort in the routine, the neatness of iron returning to the same hook, the blacksmith wiping the tongs, and the clerk writing a tidy line in the big ledger. Bureaucracy, but warm. Over your shoulder, a guard mutters about deserters, and you remember that armies also relied on marks. Mainstream fact again. European militaries branded deserters or repeat offenders well into the 18th century, treating the skin as a living passport stamped by discipline. Some marks showed unit or offense, others were simple symbols meant to warn recruiters and innkeepers alike. The idea is blunt. If your name wanders, your skin does not. You imagine being recognized by a sleeve that rides up when you reach for a tankard, not the social introduction. "Hello, I'm branded, and I'd like a refill." A gentle breeze noses through the alley and carries the faint bite of iron, and with it a memory of the pillory's laughter. This is quieter somehow, sadder. No chorus of jeers to drown out your own thoughts. Just the short, decisive moment and the long, less decisive years afterwards, when the letter does your introductions for you. Historians still argue whether branding functioned chiefly as identification for officials or as a ritual of shame for communities. Perhaps the answer drifts between the two, like heat between coal and air, useful to the record keeper, unforgettable to the neighbors. You tilt your head at the rack of letters and wonder about spelling errors. Surely not, you tell yourself. No one wants to be a typo. Yet a quirky tidbit wanders in on soft chews. Towns sometimes commissioned local smiths to maintain full sets of irons, and the gossip goes that a poorly made R could resemble a P after a single season of hard use, turning a rogue into something else entirely. Whether the story is truth or tired joke from a tavern, you spot how believable it is. The justice system runs, in part, on tools that warp with heat and hurry. You can't help a small smile. You have spent years sidestepping personalized monograms, and here you are, grateful your initials aren't in a government-approved font. There are strategies, of course. People are inventive where stains meet reputations. You picture ointments of goose fat, soot rubbed in to darken or disguise, cool cabbage leaves pressed on the burn, folk recipes whispered like kitchen secrets. Another quirky note: some offenders supposedly tried to pre-treat the skin with caustic lye or citrus to make the brand lift and blur during healing. Sometimes it helped, sometimes it only made a deeper mess. Historians still argue whether such remedies were common practice or cautionary rumor, a half-useful, half-moralizing tale to warn the hopeful. Either way, you decide your preferred remedy remains the classic: not getting branded. You study the brazier's rim and spot a water bowl set nearby, steam ghosting off its surface. It is not a spa, not a baptism, just the practical rhythm of hot and cool, press and lift, pain and ledger. Your mind slips back to earlier scenes, the parrot imitating the gavel and the whipping post beating time. Branding adds a third instrument to the orchestra, a quiet cymbal, soft but final. You wonder which instrument frightens you least. The parrot, obviously. The bird only repeats. The brand announces on its own. Another mainstream fact glides into focus. Some jurisdictions moved branding sites from cheek to hand earlier, precisely to reduce permanent facial stigma, attempting a balance between deterrence and reform. The cheek is a billboard, the hand is a filing marker. It's the difference between shouting your past at everyone and whispering it to clerks. Historians still argue whether this shift signaled a more enlightened sensibility or merely a tidier way to track bodies in a rapidly urbanizing world. You lean toward the practical answer, and then, feeling philosophical, lean back again. A turnkey ambles by, humming a tune off-key, and you think of the slow normalization of such scenes. The first time, it is shocking. The fifth time, it is a list item before lunch. That, you privately think, might be the most unsettling feature, when the extraordinary becomes a form to fill out, an entry to balance. You rub your thumb once more, as though smoothing out a crease in a glove, and you promise yourself to keep to quiet streets and honest measurements at the market. Light joke number 2, if you must decorate your hand, let it be with ink from a leaky quill, not from a government iron. Much easier to wash off, even if it stains your cuff. Sleep tugs at the edges of your awareness, while the brazier hums like a small, well-mannered dragon. The iron letters hang in a neat row, shadows spelling senseless words on the wall as the coals flicker. In their silhouettes, you almost see a bedtime alphabet. A is for apple, B is for bread, T is for try not to. You smile at your own silliness and decide the rhyme needs work. Light joke number 3, you mentally pitch a children's primer to the clerk. He declines, citing a strict office policy against lullabies in the branding alley. A final quirky image drifts along. A pamphleteer swears he saw a magistrate insist the iron be tested on leather first, to judge the clearness of the letter. It sounds like craft pride, absurd and earnest at once. The way people fuss over the legibility of a signature on a form. You pictured the letter printed sharp on a scrap of hide, the official nodding, the blacksmith pleased. Then the real page is turned, and someone's life gets its hard comma. You breathe out slowly. The alley quiets. Somewhere not far away, a parrot turns in its sleep and mumbles a half-remembered word that could be coin, could be kind. You decide to hear the kinder one. The coals subside to a purr. You step back into the street, the night softer now, the air less sharp. Behind you, the alphabet goes still. Ahead, the town keeps breathing, a long, even rhythm, as if all the punishments you've met tonight are merely metronomes for a larger, sleepier song. You tuck your hands deep in your sleeves, thumbs hidden, and walk on.
You drift from the marketplace's echoing whip cracks toward a quieter corner where the night air smells of coal, leather, and something sharper, like a candle guttering on burnt sugar. A brazier glows in a narrow alley by the jail, and beside it rests a tidy rack of iron letters. They are simple capitals, practical as broom handles, and you realize with a small shiver that this alphabet writes on skin instead of paper. You crouch near the warmth, hearing the soft puff of a bellows and the faint clink of tongs, and you picture the routine. Heat the iron to a steady cherry red, steady the hand, press for just a breath, then pull away. It is not the shriek and spectacle of the marketplace. Branding, at least in this corner, feels like office hours, administrative, efficient, and soulless, the sort of procedure that makes you wish for a very different kind of paperwork. You stand at the threshold as the turnkey shuffles by, keys chiming like dull bells, and you think about the odd logic of letters. A T for theft, a V for vagrancy, or simply a mark that says you have already been shown mercy once. That last one makes you swallow. The mark can be a receipt for leniency, a visible benefit of clergy burned onto the thumb to stop you from collecting the same discount twice. Mainstream fact: in parts of 18th century England, offenders who escaped the harshest penalties by claiming benefit of clergy could be branded on the thumb
to signify the privilege had been used, a bureaucratic scar that clerks would check in future hearings. You flex your own thumb instinctively. If clerks are checking hands like shopkeepers check coins, you will keep your fingers in your pockets, thanks. You watch the brazier flare gently, orange peeling into red, and you imagine the little ceremony. No drum roll, no cabbage throwing, just a brief pressure and a hiss like rain on hot stone. The hush of it makes you drowsy. You could almost doze off in the heat were it not for the prickly awareness that letters might be arranged again for someone else before dawn. You try to find comfort in the routine, the neatness of iron returning to the same hook, the clerk wiping the tongs, the clerk writing a tidy line in the big ledger. Bureaucracy, but warm. Over your shoulder, a guard mutters about deserters, and you remember that armies also relied on marks. Mainstream fact again. European militaries branded deserters or repeat offenders well into the 18th century, treating the skin as a living passport stamped by discipline. Some marks showed unit or offense. Others were simple symbols meant to warn recruiters and innkeepers alike. The idea is blunt. If your name wanders, your skin does not. You imagine being recognized by a sleeve that rides up when you reach for a tankard. Not the social introduction you want. Hello, I'm branded, and I'd like a refill. A gentle breeze noses through the alley and carries the faint bite of iron, and with it a memory of the pillory's laughter. This is quieter, somehow, sadder. No chorus of jeers to drown out your own thoughts, just the short decisive moment and the long, less decisive years afterward when the letter does your introductions for you. Historians still argue whether branding functioned chiefly as identification for officials or as a ritual of shame for communities. Perhaps the answer drifts between the two, like heat between coal and air, useful to the record keeper, unforgettable to the neighbors. You tilt your head at the rack of letters and wonder about spelling errors. Surely not, you tell yourself. No one wants to be a typo. Yet a quirky tidbit wanders in on soft shoes. Towns sometimes commissioned local smiths to maintain full sets of irons, and the gossip goes that a poorly made R could resemble a P after a single season of hard use, turning a rogue into something else entirely. Whether the story is truth or tired joke from a tavern, you spot how believable it is. The justice system runs in part on tools that warp with heat and hurry. You can't help a small smile. You have spent years sidestepping personalized monograms, and here you are, grateful your initials aren't in a government-approved font. There are strategies, of course. People are inventive where stains meet reputations. You picture ointments of goose fat, soot rubbed in to darken or disguise, cool cabbage leaves pressed on the burn, folk recipes whispered like kitchen secrets. Another quirky note, some offenders supposedly tried to pre-treat the skin with caustic lye or citrus to lift and blur the brand during healing. Sometimes it helped, sometimes it only made a deeper mess. Historians still argue whether such remedies were common practice or cautionary rumor, a half-useful, half-moralizing tale to warn the hopeful. Either way, you decide your preferred remedy remains the classic, not getting branded. You study the brazier's rim and spot a water bowl set nearby, steam ghosting off its surface. It is not a spa, not a baptism, just the practical rhythm of hot and cool, press and lift, pain and ledger. Your mind slips back to earlier scenes, the parrot imitating the gavel and the whipping post beating time. Branding adds a third instrument to the orchestra, a quiet cymbal, soft but final. You wonder which instrument frightens you least. The parrot, obviously. The bird only repeats. The brand announces on its own. Another mainstream fact glides into focus. Some jurisdictions moved branding sites from cheek to hand earlier, precisely to reduce permanent facial stigma, attempting a balance between deterrence and reform. The cheek is a billboard, the thumb is a filing marker. It's the difference between shouting your past at everyone and whispering it to clerks. Historians still argue whether this shift signaled a more enlightened sensibility or merely a tidier way to track bodies in a rapidly urbanizing world. You lean toward the practical answer, and then, feeling philosophical, lean back again. A turnkey ambles past humming a tune off-key, and you think of the slow normalization of such scenes. The first time, it is shocking. The fifth time, it is a list item before lunch. That, you privately think, might be the most unsettling feature when the extraordinary becomes a form to fill out, an entry to balance. You rub your thumb once more, as though smoothing out a crease in a glove, and you promise yourself to keep to quiet streets and honest measurements at the market. Light joke number 2. If you must decorate your hand, let it be with ink from a leaky quill, not from a government iron. Much easier to wash off, even if it stains your cuff. Sleep tugs at the edges of your awareness, and the brazier hums like a small, well-mannered dragon. The iron letters hang in a neat row, shadows spelling senseless words on the wall as the coals flicker. In their silhouettes, you almost see a bedtime alphabet. A is for apple, B is for bread, T is for try not to. You smile at your own silliness and decide the rhyme needs work. Light joke number 3. You mentally pitch a children's primer to the clerk. He declines, citing a strict office policy against lullabies in the branding alley. A final quirky image drifts along. A pamphleteer swears he saw a magistrate insist the iron be tested on leather first to judge the clarity of the letter. It sounds like craft pride, absurd and earnest at once, the way people fuss over the legibility of a signature on a form. You picture the letter printed sharp on a scrap of hide, the official nodding, the blacksmith pleased. Then the real page is turned, and someone's life gets its hard comma. You breathe out slowly. The alley quiets. Somewhere not far away, a parrot turns in its sleep and mumbles a half-remembered word that could be coin, could be kind. You decide to hear the kinder one. The coals subside to a purr. You step back into the street, the air softer now, the air...
You wander out of the debtor's prison, brushing the dust from your sleeves, and step into a quieter street where moonlight drapes across low houses. In the corner of a square, you spot a curious sight, a rack of tall, narrow poles topped with gaudy, cone-shaped hats. Some are striped like candy, others painted a tired yellow, and one even has little bells dangling. You squint, then laugh softly, because these are not children's playthings. These are the ridiculous headpieces reserved for public shaming. If the pillory was a billboard for your crime, the hat was a headline, bold and humiliating. And tonight, you find yourself imagining what it would feel like to stand there wearing something so absurd
while your neighbors pretended not to stare too much. You probably wouldn't last even 5 minutes before tugging it off in frustration. The logic was as simple as it was silly. Make the punishment visible, but instead of bruises or brands, use laughter. The shame hat, also called the dunce cap in some regions, was a tool borrowed from both schools and courts. You tilt your head and picture schoolboys squirming under tall paper cones, then widen the image to grown men and women forced to parade through markets with horns, donkey ears, or mock crowns perched atop their heads. The air is chilly, but you can almost hear the snickers, and you feel the creeping blush of embarrassment that no winter breeze could cool. Mainstream fact: in early modern Europe, shame punishments were widely used, ranging from the pillory to the carrying of signs that announced offences. In German towns, people guilty of gossip or slander might be forced to wear wooden masks shaped like pig snouts or donkey heads, symbolic reminders to watch your mouth. By the 18th century, some of these practices lingered, blending civic punishment with carnivalesque tradition. Here's your quirky tidbit. In certain villages, bakers who cheated on bread weight could be marched around wearing giant baskets on their heads filled with loaves, while townsfolk teased them with chants. In Spain, minor offenders were sometimes given the San Benito, a garment painted with bright designs, then walked slowly through town like unwilling parade floats. Imagine tripping over cobblestones while everyone applauds the absurdity of your outfit. You can't help smiling. It is punishment turned costume party, with none of the fun and all of the ridicule. Historians still argue whether these humiliations were effective at curbing misbehavior or whether they simply made communities feel righteous by creating a clown to point at. Some say the visual memory of a neighbor in a donkey ear cap stuck longer than the sting of a whip, shaping social behavior through embarrassment. Others argue it only deepened resentment, with the punished carrying grudges far longer than the townsfolk carried memories. You think about both sides while picturing yourself in one of those hats. No, you'd carry that grudge to the grave. The night air shifts, and a soft breeze rings the bells dangling from one of the caps. The sound is light, almost festive, as though justice had borrowed the language of a festival just to twist it into mockery. You lean against the post and picture a gossiping woman forced to stand for hours in the town square, bells jingling whenever she nods or sighs. Every movement would be punctuated by ridicule, every cough accompanied by a chime. Somehow it feels both petty and strangely hypnotic. You remember the parrot from the courtroom, the bird repeating words it barely understood. Wasn't that also a kind of hat? A way of mocking human seriousness with something ridiculous? The parrot's squawk was accidental humor, the hat was deliberate. Yet both left reputations wobbling like a drunk on uneven stones. You smile at the connection, then yawn softly. A faint memory comes to mind. In France, a petty thief was reportedly forced to wear a tall wooden collar shaped like a wheel, painted in bright colors. He couldn't sit, couldn't lie down, only shuffle awkwardly, as if carrying a halo of disgrace. Passers-by treated him like a mobile spectacle. Another tidbit: In small Dutch towns, drunkards were sometimes paraded with barrels around their bodies, the staves clunking as they staggered like living cautionary signs against overindulgence. You imagine the barrel wobbling, the crowd chuckling, and you can't resist whispering to yourself, "A keg party gone terribly wrong." The lantern light grows softer, and you feel your eyelids heavy as though the absurdity itself were a lullaby. The hats sway slightly in the breeze, their shadows on the wall like elongated jesters. The punishment was real, the shame heavy, but tonight, in memory, it has turned comical, like a bedtime story dressed up in ribbons. You lean your head back and imagine what it would sound like to drift to sleep under one of those caps. The bells might chime softly, lulling you, the crowd's laughter fading into murmurs, then into silence. Even humiliation, when stretched long enough, becomes background noise, a rhythm your mind folds into. Historians still argue whether the persistence of these rituals shows cruelty or creativity. Were these punishments relics of medieval carnival spirit, or desperate attempts to make justice more visible in towns too small for gallows? You let the question hang, unanswered, like a hat on its post. The street is quiet now, the caps stand empty, bobbing gently, their bells whispering like distant wind chimes. You step away, imagining the ridiculous parade fading into a dreamscape where shame is weightless, laughter gentle, and punishment nothing more than a curious bedtime costume.
You drift down a lane that seems to narrow until it spills into an open field, and in the center of it looms a tall wooden frame, unmistakable even in the pale wash of moonlight. The gallows. Its silhouette cuts against the sky like an exclamation mark carved into the night. You stop a few paces back, feeling the hush that always seems to surround such places, and you realize this is not simply a tool of justice, it is also a stage. In the 18th century, execution by hanging was as much a civic performance as it was a punishment, and you stand now where thousands of feet once pressed into the dirt to watch what authorities insisted was both necessity and moral theater. You wouldn't last long in that crowd, you think, with your stomach churning at the idea of treating life and death like an afternoon's diversion. The gallows were deliberate in their scale. They were built tall not only to function, but to be seen from far away, a landmark of law visible above roofs and hedgerows. Mainstream fact: in 18th century London, Tyburn Tree was constructed with 3 uprights supporting a crossbeam wide enough to hang 20 dozen people at once. Crowds came by the thousands, bringing food, drink, and even picnic blankets, treating the event like a grim holiday. You picture yourself squeezed between vendors hawking pies and ballad sellers printing fresh verses about the condemned, the gallows looming ahead as the main attraction. The quirky tidbit arrives in your ear like a whispered aside. Some condemned criminals hired Confederates to tug at their legs during hanging, to speed death and avoid the lingering struggle of a poorly executed drop. In one recorded case, a man even bribed the hangman with brandy to ensure a quick, firm knot. You can't help but wince and chuckle at the same time. Imagine tipping your executioner as if he were your barber, with one last request for efficiency. Historians still argue whether the spectacle truly deterred crime.
Did crowds walk away resolved to behave better, or did they leave feeling entertained, humming new ballads about rogues and tricksters? Some scholars suggest the gatherings created sympathy for the condemned rather than fear of the law, with onlookers sometimes treating prisoners as folk heroes. You glance at the wooden frame and think, perhaps the authorities miscalculated. After all, people still steal bread, but they rarely forget a good story. The air smells faintly of earth and smoke, and you imagine the murmurs of the crowd as the condemned climbs the scaffold. A preacher mutters a prayer, a hangman checks his rope, and all around, spectators jostle for better views. Children perch on their fathers' shoulders, vendors cry their wares, and somewhere a fiddler plays a tune to pass the time. You stand among them, your senses filled with contradiction, the solemnity of death mingled with the hum of carnival. A detail drifts from the gallows' shadow. Some condemned were allowed to give last dying speeches, which were printed and sold as pamphlets. These confessions were half moral lesson, half cheap entertainment. Sometimes they were true, often they were exaggerated by printers eager for sales. The result? The gallows fed not only law, but literature. You imagine a sleepy Londoner in bed, candle guttering low, reading the dramatic final words of a thief as if it were a bedtime story, eerily like what you are doing now. You sigh, noticing how the wooden beams creak softly in the breeze. It's almost like a lullaby, gentle and rhythmic, though you know its history is anything but. You lean back against the trunk of a nearby tree and let your mind wander. The gallows stands as a paradox, terrifying in its purpose, but strangely soothing in its predictability. Every community knew how these performances unfolded. They began with solemn procession, swelled with crowd noise, and ended with silence. Repetition breeds familiarity, and familiarity, in its strange way, breeds calm. You picture a young apprentice in the crowd, craning his neck to see. Would he be frightened into good behavior? Or would he, years later, tell the tale of the famous hanging he saw as a boy, half proud of the memory, half unaware of the law's intended lesson? Historians still argue whether the spectacle truly deterred crime. You decide both are true, obedience for some, stories for others. The moonlight shifts, casting the gallows' shadow long across the grass. You find yourself counting the wooden bolts, the knots in the timber, anything to avoid thinking too hard about its purpose. And slowly, counting becomes rhythm, rhythm becomes calm, and calm becomes drowsiness. Another odd anecdote settles into your thoughts. At one notorious hanging, a parrot, yes, another parrot, was said to have mimicked the crowd's cries, shouting, "Hang him!" in a shrill voice. Whether fact or invention, it fits the absurd harmony of the century. Justice with feathers, punishment with bells, death with fiddlers. You almost laugh, though quietly, so not to disturb the solemnity of the empty field. You step back at last, leaving the gallows behind. Its shadow lingers in your mind, not sharp, not frightening, but softened like an old story told too many times. The crowd disperses in your imagination, lanterns bobbing away into the dark, and soon even the scaffold feels less like a weapon and more like an old wooden relic, standing silent under the stars, humming softly with the echoes of centuries. You step from the hedgerows and gallows shadow to the harbour, where masts scribble tall, sleepy lines across a moon-brushed sky. Tar smells thick as treacle. Ropes creak like old floorboards, and the planks under your boots tilt with a gentle, cradle-slow heave. You board a man-of-war at anchor, as if walking into a timber cathedral, the rigging humming faintly, and the canvas furled like folded wings. Somewhere below, a drum is lifted from its hook. Somewhere above, a boatswain's call lilts a high silver note. You pause by the mainmast, hands on the warm, pitch-dark rail as the order floats across the water. All hands witness punishment. You wouldn't last a day in this floating city of rules and ropes, you tell yourself. Your idea of shipboard discipline is usually just remembering where you left your tea. The deck gathers its audience. Sleepy men tumble from hammocks, bare feet whispering over the planks, shirts loose, hair braided with tar. In the 18th-century Navy, justice lives outdoors, under stars and sail. Mainstream fact, the Royal Navy's Articles of War required public punishments to be witnessed by the crew. It was not only penalty, but pedagogy, a warning taught out loud. The boatswain's mates step forward with the cat-o'-nine tails, cords stiffened with age and salt. The nickname Cat fits too well. It waits in a red baize bag like a temperamental pet, only friendlier to rats. You think of the courtroom carrot and nearly smirk. If that bird ever shipped out, it would perch on the mizzen and squawk "splice" at unhelpful moments. Wind pushes a thin wavelet against the hull. In reply, the drum taps a slow, inevitable beat. You can taste salt on your lips, as if the sea itself insists on joining the ceremony. A boatswain reads the charge. Desertion threatened, insolence proven, rum stolen, hammocks left unlashed. Small acts that loom large in a world where order and rope must hold a country together. Historians still argue whether the lash truly made better sailors or merely bred resentment that fermented into mutinies like those at Spithead and the Nore in 1797. You lean on the rail and let the debate lap your ankles. Discipline versus morale, fear versus fairness, storm versus safe harbor. The first strokes fall, and you do not count them. The drum does that for you. Each thud a notch in time. Another mainstream fact. Courts-martial could award dozens of lashes for common shipboard offences, and for serious crimes, a flogging round the fleet sent the condemned by boat from ship to ship, receiving portions of the sentence before every watching crew. The ocean turned into a theatre district, and punishment toured like a grim opera. It is too much spectacle for my stomach. You look instead at the horizon, where a gull draws question marks into the sky. A quirky tidbit brushes your ear. On some vessels, sailors swore that the boatswain kept his cats in brine to preserve them, and that new cords were ceremonially shown to the captain before first use. Little rituals of maintenance that felt, to superstitious minds, like bargains with the sea. Whether this all was neat reality or salty mythology, the red bag and the careful hands are real enough. Another quirky corner of shipboard life, While punishment unfolded, a ship's actual cat, furred, whiskered, blissfully unconcerned, might sun itself on a coil of line, officiating the proceedings with slow blinks. Two cats, one ceremony. You decide you prefer the one that hunts mice. You adjust your footing as the hull sighs. Even in discipline, the ship keeps gently rocking, as if shushing the scene. Hush, hush, order now. You notice the quiet choreography, sails lashed, yards squared, lanterns hooded. The crew stands in two pale rows like picket fences, faces set, shoulders steady. Some men look stern, others look inward. In this swaying city of wood and will, emotions must be tied off like halyards, neat and out of the way. Light joke number 1. Somewhere, a future bureaucrat is inventing HR for ships, hull relations, then gives up because the paperwork keeps sliding off the table. You drift with your eyes to the scuttlebutt, where a water cask sits like a friendly barrel. You remember another mainstream fact. Admiral Edward Vernon in the 1440s ordered sailors' daily rum ration diluted with water and citrus, grog, to curb drunkenness and scurvy's bite. Discipline and diet serve in the same watch bill, you think. Oranges and orders, lime and lines. Historians still argue whether grog tamed rum or simply taught sailors to love a weaker riot. You taste phantom lime on your tongue and decide a cup might make anyone more philosophical about rope. A line of holy stones, those pumice blocks sailors push to whiten decks, rests by the forehatch, patient as church pews. Tomorrow at dawn they'll scrape the planks into bright cleanliness. Tonight they sit like quiet jurors, ready to judge grime. Light joke number 2. Nothing solves a moral crisis like scrubbing until the deck achieves a higher spiritual shine. In this world, the list of sins is long, but the list of chores is longer. The boatswain's call trills again, higher now, and the drum fades. The surgeon waits with his small chest of remedies, vinegar, lint, a steadier breath than anyone else on deck. The crowd exhales as if the ship herself has been holding lungs. There's a hushed, practical compassion in the ritual's tail end. Salve, water, a blanket, a quiet word. No lingering on the details. Sleep will come later, carried by the sea's patient arms. Historians still argue whether these post-punishment ministrations humanized a brutal system or merely kept it runnable. You sense both truths, rocking side by side, friendly as bunkmates who snore at different times. The wind freshens and ropes hum in the dark. Somewhere on the quarterdeck a lieutenant adjusts his hat, and you catch the elegant boredom of routine authority. You try to picture yourself as an officer, keeping ledger-perfect calm while the ocean writes unruly cursive beneath your feet. Light joke number 3. You imagine issuing an order with confidence, only to add, and, could someone remind me which rope is the thing that does the thing? An admirably knotty question. The sailors would answer with that quiet, respectful look that means, "Aye, sir," and also, "Bless his heart." A story sidles up like a slow tide, keel-hauling, dragging a man under the hull from one rail to the other, has long haunted sea lore. Quirky, grim, and rare, it floats between rumour and record. Historians still argue whether keel-hauling remained a real 18th-century practice or grew into a sailor's bogeyman, a threat more frightening for how seldom it showed its face. You glance over the side at the green-black glide of water and decide that some punishments need no reality to make the point. The imagination is an efficient hangman. When the crew is dismissed, the deck exhales into motion. Hammocks sway, pipes glow, a fiddle scratches out a tune that could be a lullaby if you tilt your head and forgive the sea for tapping time. Murmurs bloom in knots, scuttlebutt in both senses, opinions soft as bread. Was the sentence fair? Was the boast
You step back onto dry cobblestones, the sea fading behind you, and the night carries you through narrower streets until you glimpse a small wooden platform in front of the parish hall. At first it looks like a stage for a play, plain boards, modest railings, but the iron mask dangling from a hook tells you otherwise. It is the scold's bridle, also called the brank, an iron cage shaped to fit a woman's head with a flat piece or spiked plate designed to press against the tongue. You lean close, shivering slightly as the faint smell of rust and oil clings to the contraption. The mask looks almost theatrical, as if some village blacksmith once moonlighted as a costume maker. But you know the purpose was to silence, not entertain. You mutter to yourself that you probably wouldn't last 5 minutes in this thing. You barely tolerate wearing headphones that pinch your ears. The punishment was often reserved for scolds, a word applied broadly, sometimes to women accused of nagging, gossiping, or quarreling in public. It was less about justice and more about enforcing silence in a society that prized orderly speech. Mainstream fact. Throughout the 17th and 18th centuries, these devices appeared across Britain and parts of continental Europe, employed to punish women whose words were deemed disruptive. Records from Scotland and the north of England describe parish authorities fitting the brank, then parading the wearer through town so the whole community could witness her forced silence. You crouch beside the mask, running your finger just above its jagged edge, and you can't help imagining how heavy it must have felt on the skull. Metal pressing against cheekbones, jaw aching, neck straining with each step. The discomfort wasn't just physical, it was symbolic. Every word forced back, every syllable swallowed. You can almost hear the hollow rattle of the bridle as the wearer shuffled down the lane, townsfolk pretending to look busy at their stalls while sneaking sideways glances. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some scolds' bridles were crafted with bells attached, so that every movement jingled faintly, ensuring all eyes turned toward the punished. Imagine the humiliation, each step chiming like a parody of a festive procession. Others were engraved with mocking phrases like chatterbox or tongue of evil. It was costume theatre again, but theatre with no applause, only ridicule. Historians still argue whether the brank was widely enforced or more symbolic.
whether communities often used it or merely kept one hanging in the parish hall as a threat. Some scholars say the number of documented cases is small compared to the notoriety the object gained, suggesting it was more bogeyman than daily instrument. Others argue that silence by nature leaves fewer records, so the truth may be heavier than the surviving files reveal. You lean back, weighing both sides, thinking that sometimes the absence of voices is the hardest evidence to measure. The atmosphere feels hushed here, even more than at the gallows post or the whipping post. There is no crowd laughter in your imagination, no fiddler by the tavern, only the echo of a bell, the shuffle of feet, and the stubborn silence of someone who cannot speak. It is eerie, but in a strangely lulling way, as if the world itself has pressed pause. You stand still, listening to the night air, which suddenly seems softer when you imagine a voice suppressed. A small irony sidles into your mind. In some towns, the punishment included being led to the marketplace, tethered by a rope, forced to stand while neighbors lectured. The offender could not reply, of course, so the scolding was one-sided, a peculiar theater of words against silence. You can almost picture a stern matron wagging her finger while the poor figure jingles faintly, unable to argue. You shake your head softly, a faint smile tugging despite yourself. Light joke number 1. It's the original mute button, though far less user-friendly. You picture another scene, a woman wearing the brank, seated on a church bench, forced to endure a long sermon while the congregation glanced sideways, the spikes pressing her tongue each time she shifted. The silence must have been more deafening than the organ itself. Historians still argue whether church authorities sanctioned this or whether it was strictly civic punishment, and you feel the uncertainty lingering in the air like incense smoke. Your steps carry you past the parish hall and toward a low stone bridge. In the distance, a dog barks lazily, and a lantern swings from a post, casting shadows that make the mask's silhouette dance on the wall like a grotesque puppet. You think of all the masks earlier, the shame hats with bells, the pillory with bread necklaces. This one feels heavier, though quieter, as if ridicule has been condensed into metal. And yet there is something hypnotic about its stillness. Another quirky anecdote comes to mind. In one case, a woman supposedly bit down on the tongue plate so hard that she bent it slightly, leaving the blacksmith annoyed at the damage. Whether this story is true or exaggerated, it reveals an odd note of agency. Even in silence, resistance found small ways to speak. You can't help but respect that. Light joke number 2. If you can dent steel with sheer stubbornness, perhaps you deserve a medal instead of a bridle. The night around you grows even softer now. The bells on the bridle sway faintly, whispering a lullaby that no one asked for. And in that sound you find yourself calmer, eyes heavy, the cruel object transformed into a curious bedtime relic. Punishment has drifted once again into rhythm, into the gentle sway of bells, into the hush of silence, into a story that continues without raising its voice.
You leave the parish square behind and follow a twisting lane until it opens onto a green
where the grass grows high around an old stone plinth. Upon it, carved so faintly you have to squint, are the remnants of animal figures: pig, goat, even a cat. At first you think it might be a weathered market cross, but then you notice the curious iron rings embedded along its sides. This was no simple monument. It was once a stage for animal trials, those curious ceremonies in which beasts were dragged before magistrates, charged with crimes, and sentenced with the same solemnity as men. You lean closer and chuckle softly. It is one thing to imagine a thief in the pillory, quite another to picture a goat in the dock. You wouldn't last long as a juror here. You'd be the one snickering when the judge tried to maintain a straight face. The notion sounds absurd, but mainstream fact. Throughout medieval and early modern Europe, trials of animals were indeed held, and the practice lingered into the 18th century. Pigs were the most common defendants, often accused of biting or trampling children. Records tell us of solemn courtrooms where lawyers argued both sides, as if the pig's intention could be weighed like silver. Sometimes the poor beast was dressed in clothing, jackets, breeches, even hats, so that the trial could mimic the dignity of human cases. You almost laugh out loud. Fashion never looked so ridiculous. A quirky tidbit drifts into your imagination. In Switzerland, a colony of insects, yes, actual weevils, was once excommunicated by a bishop for destroying crops. The ceremony involved chanting, incense, and formal banishment from fields, as though the bugs were stubborn tenants overstaying their lease. You imagine the bishop scolding a row of beetles while farmers looked on, torn between reverence and disbelief. If nothing else, it must have been excellent dinner-table conversation. Historians still argue whether these trials were meant as sincere legal acts or elaborate rituals to appease anxious communities. Did people truly believe animals bore moral responsibility? Or were these spectacles simply a way of symbolically confronting misfortune? Perhaps the truth is somewhere in between, a blend of belief and theatre, of legal seriousness and community catharsis. You lean on the stone plinth, the grass brushing your ankles, and you feel the ambiguity settle over you like a fog. You picture the scene, a pig, tethered and squealing, brought into court. A clerk dutifully scribbles notes, the judge clears his throat, and the townsfolk lean in to hear whether the beast will be fined, imprisoned, or, most often, executed. The absurdity of it makes you smirk, yet you can also sense the weight it carried for those present. To them it was order restored, justice served, even if the criminal was a four-legged creature that cared only for scraps. Another quirky note: in France, cats were sometimes accused of witchcraft, believed to be accomplices in nocturnal mischief. Some were burned, others banished. Yet in the same era, cats were cherished for keeping granaries safe, a double life indeed. Pest controller by day, suspected sorcerer by night. You can almost hear one purring on a windowsill, utterly indifferent to its dual reputation. Light joke number 1, if cats could talk at their trials, they would simply yawn, demand fish, and nap through the verdict. The parrot from earlier echoes in your mind again, squawking its nonsense in a courtroom of humans. How fitting that its feathered cousins once stood accused themselves. Imagine a parrot on trial for spreading gossip, forced to repeat its own incriminating evidence. Justice might have collapsed entirely into farce. Like joke number 2, Your Honour, I plead not guilty. Also, crackers, please. You glance up at the stars. bright pinpricks above the dark hedges, and the night feels oddly calm. The absurdity of animal trials, far from unsettling you, lulls your thoughts. There is something soothing about knowing that history contains these pockets of ridiculous solemnity, moments when humans insisted on order even in the face of chaos, even if it meant scolding beetles or sentencing pigs. It is bureaucracy at its most creative and at its most comical. Historians still argue whether communities truly believed in the legal personality of animals, or whether these trials were simply metaphors, stories dressed in legal robes. The records blur fact and fable, seriousness and satire. You imagine sitting in the jury box, trying not to nod off as a liar delivers a long argument about the moral culpability of a goat. Truthfully, you would drift off, and maybe that is the point. These trials, more than anything, feel like bedtime stories told with too much formality. A final quirky anecdote whispers in. In one case, a donkey accused of improper behavior was acquitted after villagers testified to its upright character and pious demeanor. You nearly laugh out loud at the image of solemn neighbors swearing to a donkey's good reputation. Light joke number 3, perhaps the donkey had better references than half the townsfolk. You step away from the plinth at last, the grass swaying around your ankles, and you feel the night soften. The silence is broken only by a far-off owl, a witness with no intention of testifying. The stars keep their impartial watch, and you, lulled by the memory of absurd trials, drift onward, the night folding you deeper into its sleepy arms.